I don't know about you, but I have to admit that in this story, regardless of whether you believe in a physical resurrection or whether you believe in a spiritual resurrection, whatever resurrection you believe in, I believe that the point of this story is in that closing sentence when Jesus broke bread with them and unveiled and revealed who he was. You see, ministry from the margins doesn't mean that we come with all of our answers. Ministry from the margins doesn't mean that we come knowing Jesus or even encountering Jesus or even seeing Jesus right up front. Ministry from the margins means that we go to the very broken places of the world, the people who have been so rejected, the people who have been so marginalized, the people who have been so excluded from every social structure that we could possibly imagine. That the church, Christian church, of people who follow Jesus should always be found on those places of society. And that it is in our example, it is in our breaking of bread, it is in our living experience of Jesus that folks get to see the risen Jesus today. That you and I are the living example of Jesus in the world today. And just as they acknowledged Jesus when they broke bread, so people will acknowledge Jesus today when we sit alongside the stranger and break bread with them. You know, our churches aren't the most friendliest places to those who are on the margins of society. You know, we sometimes think that our churches try to be inclusive, but the reality is that our churches aren't very inclusive. And I'm not just talking about this congregation, although I think we try to do the best that we can in being as inclusive as possible. But the reality is that Christianity is not a very inclusive place. Christianity is a place where only the respectable can come to. Yeah, and we kind of emphasize that sometimes in our language, sometimes in our behavior, sometimes in the way we react to one another. That oftentimes we'll only meet people not at their place of need, but at our place of need. And that people can only really be fully accepted into the welcoming and worshiping community if they look like us, think like us, dream like us, and aspire like us. The reality is that churches are not very friendly places. I hope that the folks who are here for the very first time this morning find that we're trying to be a welcoming and open environment, and that we really are trying to make this an inclusive experience for all of us to be able to encounter Jesus, no matter where we are on that faith spectrum. But the reality is that not many churches are like that. And that's not to set ourselves up as something better than anybody else. I don't mean us to do that. But just the reality is that we're trying to work very hard at being the church of Jesus Christ and to acknowledge the God that Jesus knew, not the God that the Christian church of the 2009 knows. Because I think there's a radical difference between the God that Jesus knew and the God that the church tends to preach 2,000 years later. That the God that Jesus knew was a one of inclusion. The God that Jesus knew was one that continually went out to the margins further and further and further outside of all that was respectable in his own faith. That is the God that Jesus preached about. It is that God that we try to preach in this church, who will continue to go and break down barriers and doors and tear down walls and make bridges between folks, between those who have been excluded, as well as those who think that they are totally on the inside. Jesus came to that place in his own life. And folks, the only way that people are going to know a resurrected Jesus today is not only through the testimonies that we heard this morning, and Jeff really did give a wonderful testimony. One of these days, I really hope that you'll sit down with Jeff and ask him the gory details of his life, pre-Jesus. I've had the fortune to hear most of it. And, he and I share a similar story in so many different ways. But to know that the resurrection power and the way that we get to know Jesus today is just as they got to know Jesus 2,000 years ago, is that we sit down with one another and we break bread. We unveil, we break down all of the barriers that have separated us. I think that our world sometimes has a vested interest in keeping us apart. Even my own statement about, from Scripture that women confuse the men. The reality is that women don't confuse men and men don't confuse women. We just don't sit down often enough together to really come to an understanding of who we are and about the way that we think and the way that we dream and the way that we live. We have a vested interest in keeping ourselves separate, believing somehow that we're better than anybody else. The people realized that Jesus had risen again was when they welcomed the stranger into their midst and sat with them and heard their story. That's when they realized that Jesus had risen again. That's when you and I realize that Jesus is within each and every one of us, not by looking at appearances or not making our own judgments or not pretending that we know something about another person that's by hearsay and not by really sitting down with one another and hearing our stories. You know, one of the groups that we have in our church that is so often not talked about, but is, I think, it's so often misunderstood, is the people of leather among you. And I say that because, you know, we don't often talk about it from the pulpit. We had Leather Sunday just a few Sundays ago, and I wish I was. I was present here for that Sunday, but I wish I was more present here for that Sunday. We had Leather and Feather Sunday, but I know that there are some folks in our congregation who are uncomfortable about the way we embrace the leather community within our church. And they're uncomfortable because of our own preconceived ideas about what the leather community is all about. And I want to tell you, if ever you've sat down with the leather community in our church and you've broke bread with them, and you've opened up your life to them, and they've opened up their life to you, I want to tell you, sisters and brothers, there's no need for us to judge anybody who lives differently from us. Because I want to tell you, there is Jesus in that group. And there is Jesus in the presence of those people's lives, which is so awesome and so powerful. And we don't just do that with people of leather. We do that with people of color. We do that with people who are different from us. We do that with people who don't believe like us. We forget to sit down with one another and break bread. You see, that's how they got to know Jesus. I'm so grateful to be a pastor of a church that is so diverse. I mean, just look around us this morning. There's young and old and male and female and children and black and white and Latino and brown and yellow and all variations. I mean, even got a Brit preaching this morning. I mean, you know, how diverse could we get? I mean, there is just such, and we come from such different backgrounds and such different places on our journey. You know, we have Brad who seeks the southern accent, and you know, I tell you, when Brad first came to me, I don't want to embarrass you, Brad, but when Brad first came to me, it was a general conference just a couple of years ago, and you know, Brad came to me and he said, you know, I really think that I should be at MCCLA to do my internship, and I looked at Brad, and I want to tell you, I had my own preconceived ideas about Brad before he even came to talk to me, and many of those preconceived ideas were not just based on your accent, but because I knew you came from the South. And I was like, how on earth is Brad, who, you know, my own preconceived ideas, coming from the South, is bound to be far more conservative in his theology than I am. How on earth is Brad going to mix with a progressive liberal who's kind of far out on the edge? And I made my own judgments about Brad's theology. And I was like, oh my God, it's going to be like oil and water, and it's going to take so much time to move him to my way of thinking. You know, one of the things I realized was that actually I really didn't need to do anything apart from break bread with Brad and to sit with him and say, Brad, you know, I've got my own preconceived ideas about you, and I'm sure you've got your own preconceived ideas about me. But by sitting down with one another at the very margins to find the places where we hold in common were the places from which we could grow. I want to tell you, Brad, you've changed my theology, and I hope I've changed your theology. I pray that we've opened Scripture together. And in that, we have not only met at the margins, but we've found Jesus in those places, in the margins of our lives.